Perhaps you've been in a situation like this. I know that I have. Someone believed in you and you let them down. Someone trusted you and you betrayed that trust. Someone assigned you an important task and you failed. And now everyone knows about it. What was it for you? Was it dropping out of college or failing at your marriage? Maybe you stole something that didn't belong to you, or you lied to your spouse, or even dropping the touchdown pass in the end zone that cost your team the championship game. What do you do in that kind of situation? Where do you go when you've messed up? I mean really messed up. Do you run? Do you hide? You feel ashamed. You feel afraid. You feel embarrassed. You want to set things right again, but how do you do that? How can you ever face those people you have supremely disappointed? Our second reading today was written in the context of just such a failure. A slave named Onesimus had wronged his master, Philemon. We don't know the nature of the mistake. Maybe he stole something. Maybe he lied to his master. Maybe he mistreated one of Philemon's kids. Whatever he did, Onesimus saw only one way out, and that was to run. And by doing so, Onesimus made his failure, whatever it was, even worse. And then he was caught. And so the situation was now compounded. In the first century, the punishment for a runaway slave was very severe. The best he could hope for was a severe beating and the loss of any hope for freedom. More likely, he was probably facing crucifixion when he was caught. But God had other plans for this slave. In fact, only God could make something good come out of a mess like this. But then again, isn't that the way God often works? He did it with Moses after he had killed a man. He did it with King David after he had his affair. He did it with Mary Magdalene. He did it with St. Peter. He did it with St. Augustine. And he did it for countless other peoples throughout our Christian history. And the really good news today is that he's willing to do it for us. So how does that happen? It begins when we face our failures head on and do all within our power to restore a damaged relationship. Notice how that principle applies to Onesimus, apparently a runaway slave who is caught and then put in prison. In jail, he meets another prisoner, a man named Paul, who was a Christian. We aren't privy to their whole conversation, but we know that Onesimus becomes a Christian under the tutelage of St. Paul. What hope it must have been for him to hear about a God who welcomes the outcast home, who restores the broken and the brokenhearted, who loves the least and the lost with grace and mercy and forgiveness. But Paul did not offer Onesimus an easy grace or a cheap forgiveness, devoid of responsibility to the one he offended. Yes, God forgave Onesimus, but now there was still work for Onesimus to do, to restore his relationship with his master Philemon. Seeking that forgiveness would be hard, even risky, to be sure. But Onesimus had hurt Philemon, and that wound needed to be healed for the sake of both of them. There was only one way to set that failure right again, and that was to send Onesimus back to Philemon. I would imagine that Onesimus was not thrilled with the idea when Paul proposed it to him. But Paul knew it was the only road to true reconciliation and healing. Paul knew that Onesimus would never be over his mistake if he had to keep looking over his shoulder or dreading the day he might run into Philemon again. He had to go back and face the one he hurt. That was true for Onesimus, and that is true for us. Even if you think you've gotten away with your deceit, even if you think you can run so far away that no one will ever be able to catch up to you, even if you now claim God's forgiveness, you still have to face your past. Do the right thing. Do the courageous thing and face the one you offended. That's the only way to totally restore a relationship for both you and the person that you've hurt. Of course, even if you try this effort at reconciliation, you cannot control the reaction of the offended party. That you must leave to God and to them. Today, Paul convinced Onesimus to return to Philemon. It was a courageous act, to be sure. No one could guarantee the reaction of Philemon when Onesimus came through his front door. But Paul did not send him back empty-handed. He wrote a personal letter to Philemon, and that brief and personal note is now recorded as one of the books of our Bible. It is the shortest of all of Paul's letters that the church has saved, and it's also the most personal in nature. And in these brief sentences, Paul may have penned his most revolutionary words, for Paul uses every means of persuasion in his arsenal to appeal to Philemon to welcome Onesimus, not as a fugitive slave, but as a Christian brother. And if that could happen, can you imagine the witness that would have been to the early church? This is what forgiveness looks like. This is true reconciliation. Did it work? Did Philemon and Onesimus embrace as brothers after reading that letter from St. Paul? Obviously, Philemon had a choice to make, but we might assume that he chose a path of grace, joining God in this healing act of forgiveness and mercy. Otherwise, I don't think we'd have that letter today. A letter saved by the church that must have been electrified by this stunning act of grace and reconciliation. And a couple of decades later, an early church father, St. Ignatius of Antioch, records that there was a leader in the church of Colossia, a man who was named Onesimus. Was it the same Onesimus, a name that means useful? Could it be that this useless failure was now a useful servant of God? Could a runaway slave become a Christian brother and then later also become a bishop of the church? Where else on earth could such a colossal failure turn into such a colossal leader? Only one place, a place called church.